Good evening. I'm Caryn Thexton. I'm a college counselor at Trinity Christian Academy in Addison, Texas, which is right outside of Dallas. And tonight I'm going to talk about test optional what's next. For students and parents, there's a lot of concern and sort of anxiety when it comes to how to make yourself stand out or how to think about applying to college if you don't have an ACT or SAT test score, or even if you're not available to test. So the questions tonight, with so many colleges not requiring SAT or ACT for admissions, what's next and what are the schools going to focus on? And then how can you as a student be best prepared for these changes? So first things first, I just want to encourage all of us to sort of stop and take a breath. In the last several months, all of us have had to be flexible, and that's not very much fun, and there can be some panic and anxiety with that. So I just will tell myself to do this as I'm working with students: take a breath and think, okay, I'm not going to have an SAT score and ACT score. How might God be using this in my own life? What I like about this shift to going away from test scores, going away from a number, is it helps us have more intentional conversations about how are you made as a student? What's God done in your life? What gifts has He given you? So consider, how is God using this in my life? And then also to consider that we're all learning together. So whether you're a student trying to figure out, oh, I had this testing planned and now I don't know what I want to do. If you're a parent thinking, how am I going to guide my student? If you're a college counselor thinking, oh, how am I going to help my families walk through this? Even on the college side, there are lots of college admissions officers who are going through this too, thinking, oh, this is something I used to do. I used to be able to take numbers from test scores and evaluate admissions files like that, and they're having to change as well. So we're all in this learning together. So before we talk about some things that you can do in your application, let's just talk about the pros and cons of being test optional. So the pros of going to a test optional model, or colleges evaluating your application without a test score, is they have the ability to look at an individual rather than a number. So you stand out as a student based on your own qualities, not just how you perform on a test. The test score really focuses on a snapshot in time, but grades are historically a better way to determine success in college. So how you're feeling on that Saturday morning when you took your ACT or SAT test, or how a student performs. Maybe they drove up to the test site and they got lost and they didn't know where they were going, and then they sat down, and that's not really a good picture of who you are as a human in life. It's just a snapshot of a Saturday morning. And so this approach allows you to really present yourself as a whole person and not just a number. So those are the pros. Some cons. Right now, if a college or university had some standards for assured admission based on test scores, so if you're thinking, oh, I just have to get a certain test score in order to get into XYZ university, that's changed now, and it might not be as easy to tell. Colleges and universities are still adjusting to their figuring out how they're going to admit students. And some schools have already have a process in place, and some are still working on that. So it's not as straightforward maybe for some students. And then there's another piece, the scholarship requirement. It might not be as easy to determine, where in the past, if you got a certain score, maybe you thought like, oh, I'm going to get this kind of a scholarship, this kind of tuition merit money. That might not be as easy to tell right now, as schools are still putting together their rubrics and determining how they're going to award scholarships without test scores. And then if you spent some time and money on test prep, for some students, that's really disheartening to think, oh, I've put a lot of time into preparing for a test, so now I'm not able to take one. My test keeps getting canceled. I'm going to apply test optional. So there's good and bad about this, but tonight we're going to talk about how you can spend some time on your application to highlight the special skills and gifts that God's given you. When we talk about what colleges and universities are looking at, this comes from a survey from 2019. Admissions counselors all over the country report these factors are of considerable or moderate importance in the college admissions evaluation. So that number one is grades in courses, and then grades in college prep courses, the strength of curriculum. That number 4 was admissions test score. So this is a change. This is going to be something, an adjustment for sure. The counselor recommendation can hold some weight. An essay, the way that you write your essay, teacher recommendation. So you can see in the list, some of those things are things that you or I as a student can control. There's some of those things that you can't control. So I want to talk about a few things that you can highlight or you can control. So tonight we'll talk about the grades. How can you highlight or talk about your grades in this process? Or outside involvement, what does that look like? Is it the typical things that we always think about, or are there other things that we want to include? What are some intangible skills that wouldn't show up on a test score report sheet, but maybe those are some benefits that you can bring to a college or university, some helpful skills that you might not even realize you have as a student. Then, are there some special skills or talents that a student has? And then, has the student made progress? So let's take a look at some of these ways to highlight. First way is grades in high school. So if I'm applying, I want to think about what classes are my favorites, what energize me, and if I'm looking over my transcript, my academic record, I might love math and science, and I do really well in those classes. And English isn't my favorite subject, so I'm doing okay in that class, but it's not my favorite. That's okay. In this process, which classes are your favorites? And if you are a junior and you're still taking classes next year, then man, play to those strengths. Don't put pressure on yourself to get straight A's in every single one of your classes, but the classes that come easy for you and that you like, and take advantage of your interaction in those classes. So what classes are your favorites? What energizes you when you're taking a look at your grades? Uphill trends. Are there some uphill trends? So sometimes freshmen maybe start out with a little bit of, they have problems getting momentum. So freshman year, you might goof around a little bit, or you might be having a rough time transitioning to high school. And so you start out slow. Maybe you start out with some lower grades in some of your classes. That happens a lot, but has there been progress? Did you sort of figure something out along the way? Oh man, I need to knock this off. I need to get into what I need to do as far as taking care of business in the classroom. Sometimes mom or dad will say, if you don't start taking some responsibility for your grades, there are going to be some consequences. Other times you get maybe a learning difference figured out. Anyway, is there an uphill trend? Even if you started out on some rocky ground, have you made progress? And I think for a lot of students, there's progress to talk about. And then time management. If I'm looking at my grades and I'm thinking, oh, my friend, she makes all straight A's and I've got some B's and maybe a C or two. But then I look at my time, how I spend my time, and I think, well, my friend, she just goes to school and then she goes home, and that's kind of her life. But I'm playing a couple of sports. I'm doing some community service. I might have a part-time job. When I think about who I am as a person, and then I look at my grades, oh, I think I've done I made some pretty good strides as far as managing my time. So when you're looking at your grades, and moms and dads, as you're looking at the grades of your students, consider what those grades are in the context of what's going on in life, whether it's sports commitments, whether it's volunteer service, whether it's jobs. If you had a schedule like that, if you have a challenging schedule, and you're managing to divide your time and getting your homework done and tending to your other responsibilities, that's something to be proud of, and that's something that you want to make sure that it comes out on your college application. So grades, that's the first area. Then what do you do with your time when you're not in the classroom? What sort of involvement is there? And for some students, it might be athletics, might be school sports, it might be outside sports, it might be a team sport or an individual sport. But these things take some time, take up some time outside of school. So I think that that's always important. You hear people talk about being involved in extracurricular activities. I think it's important to point out that that doesn't mean you're involved in every single one, but you might be an athlete and you really enjoy participating in sports, and not just participating in sports, but let's just say you are a part of a team that makes it to regionals or makes it to playoffs, or you advance as the year goes on. Even if you're not a starter, I think it's important for students to realize that if you're going to practice and you're participating and you're part of the team um, atmosphere, just because you're not starting doesn't mean that you didn't contribute to that. So I've talked to students before, they say, well, like, yeah, we won regionals, but I wasn't starting. Okay, maybe you weren't. However, you were taking part in practices, you were part of the team community, and that's important. That is time that you took out of your day to commit to something bigger than you. So I think that's important to highlight. So maybe you're involved in athletics, maybe you volunteer, whether it's church or community service. What do you do some things outside of school? And then some students have work to report. So maybe a student has a part-time job and they work at a restaurant or a grocery store, or maybe they do odd jobs in the neighborhood or work for mom and dad. But it's important to say, like, oh, I've got some responsibilities that I'm showing up for besides just in the classroom. Then there's some intangible traits. People call these soft skills, that I think this gives us an opportunity to sit down with our students and say, okay, or students, think about, like, there are some things that maybe you possess, gifts that God's given you or you've learned through going through situations, that it would be important for you to realize and take away as you talk about going into the college application process. Integrity, you can't really measure that on a scale, you can't hold it, but I'm sure there are lots of opportunities where you've had to maybe take a path that was hard to travel, but you knew that it was the right thing to do. So do you have integrity? Have you developed that through your high school career? Do you have empathy? Do you have a strong work ethic? Are you responsive to feedback? Are you teachable or coachable? My goodness, that's hard. But if you are able to give examples of situations where you're like, man, this really was hard to hear this kind of feedback, but I knew I needed to hear it. Are you kind to people? I feel like that these soft skills or intangible traits, moms and dads and other adults in your life can point these out to you that maybe you're not giving yourself credit for. And I would love for this to take over when we're talking about test optional. If the numbers go away, let's start talking about how God's gifted you and how you've reacted in situations with some of these traits. And then special skills or talents. Is there something really unusual? Are you a musician? Do you play the guitar? Do you paint? Are you creative? Are you athletic? The other asterisk, that's always that one that, like, maybe your friends don't even know that you do this, but you have a special skill or a talent. You are really good with a sewing machine. You can fix just about anything that you put your hands on. Mom and dad are always calling you to help you, ask you to tinker with things around the house. I have a student who has entered lots and lots of Rubik's Cube competitions, and like that seems like that's not super common. And so he's like, no, it's fun for me. That's what these special skills and talents are. These are things that are fun for a student, but maybe you're not going to give yourself credit for. So those other special skills or talents, those are usually the really fun outside of the box skills. And then lastly, has there been progress? So if you think about your entire high school career, educational career, is there a subject or class that you've made strides in? And I don't mean you went from an F to an A+, but man, you hit the ground with geometry and you thought, I hate this class, I'm not going to be able to get through it. and you were able to see some progress. Hey, I started getting B's on my quizzes. I met with my teacher once a week to go over concepts, and I ended with a really solid B that I was proud of by the end of the year. That's the kind of progress you can think about with grades. It doesn't mean I made the top score and I got hundreds. It means that you made a difference and you engaged in the class. Situational. Did something happen in your life, in your family? Did you move? Did you go to a new school, adjust to a difficult life situation where you can look back and say, oh, that was something that I really had to work hard to adjust to. And it might not have been fun, but I came through it. And then awareness. If you think back about students who you are or parents who your student was when they were in ninth grade, there might be some things now that you're much more aware of that's important to you, um, that that you want to make sure that you carry that into college. So are there some things, some issues, some different traits that you're more aware of as you've grown older? I'm going to just point out some quick case studies from some students I worked with. Um, this first study, our student Ashton, her grades A's and B's. She liked some subjects, connected with its teachers, didn't connect with other teachers as well. Didn't have a lot of sports or extracurricular activities. And when she came to me, she said, yeah, I don't really have anything for my resume. Well, the more we talked, I found out, oh, she decided that she was really interested in weaving. So she saved up some money, purchased a small loom on the internet, had it shipped to her house with her hard-earned money, learned how to weave, taught herself how to use a sewing machine, wrote some scripts in her free time. And she was like, well, that's not extracurricular. That I just like to do that. Those are things that you can put on your resume because that's what she's spending her time in. That's showing some perseverance and some curiosity. So it was really fun to come up with her resume. Then we have Claudia. Claudia has A's, B's, a few C's. Her extracurricular activities, she played some team sports in 9th and 10th grade. However, the thing that maybe she wasn't willing to point out right at first is after she was able to get her driver's license, she was responsible for her siblings, getting them to and from school, homework help, after school care. So she didn't have a lot of time to do other things. So that needed to come out in her application somewhere. And then finally, we have Zach. Zach was an AB student. He wasn't involved in anything except football all 4 years, but his last 2 years, they had losing seasons. And so he was thinking, like, that's not that big of a deal. I don't know how to talk about that. After pressing and getting a little bit more information, I found out that on this losing season, he was really the team leader, the encourager to say, like, yeah, we're losing, but we're going to keep encouraging each other and sticking together despite the low morale. He's continuing to support the team. So we've talked about these great qualities and some things to think about yourself as a student. How do you communicate this in your application? Let me go over that and then we'll have some time for a few questions. The first way is through a resume. Some schools will say that you're welcome to contribute a resume. In high school, just think of a resume as a listing of the time, what you've spent your time doing outside of school. So it might be sports, it might be volunteer service, it might be some talents or some hobbies that you've developed. If you really like to learn different computer languages and you spend some time kind of combing through that information, highlighting that. The girl with her loom, she learned how to weave. Like, that was really cool. So a resume is a good way to just list out what types of things interest you and what you spent your time doing, even if it's not what you think is a typical resume answer. Short answer. Some schools will have you have a short answer opportunity to give some thoughts on a favorite extracurricular activity or some growth areas that you've had. So take advantage of those opportunities. Sometimes as a student, it feels like it's hard, like you're bragging about yourself to answer and to respond to some of those, but it's really important for you to understand that a college or university is trying to get to who you are and your special, specific personality. Essay questions are a great time to tell a story about something, whether it's a story of something that you've learned or something that you enjoy as far as a hobby, but take that, part seriously, especially in the test optional world. This is how they're trying to figure out, okay, who is this person? I've seen their grades, but really what makes them tick? And I think the essay is how your personality can come out. And then finally, follow-up conversations. I know this after working with college representatives, especially NACAP college representatives for the last 10 years, they're going to be your biggest cheerleader. So if there's not a way for you to say in your application, oh, I had a really rough ninth grade year, I think it's great to open up that line of conversation with your admissions rep and say, like, I'm really worried about that C on my transcript or that D on my transcript. Here's the story behind that. How can I best communicate that? So informal or formal conversations with your college admissions rep, that's going to be a great way to advocate for yourself and tell a story of who God has made you. So here is my contact information, Caryn Thexton, cthexton@trinitychristian.org. I'm wondering, we have some time for some questions.
Yeah, Caryn, there were a couple that came in through the webinar chat, so I'll just read those and let you kind of speak to them.
Okay.
One is, if I submit a low test score with a great GPA and get declined, would someone who didn't submit a test score be more likely to get accepted?
So low test score, great GPA versus
no test score.
So the idea that we tell students as you're looking at whether you're going to submit a test score. So if you're making this decision, like, do I want to submit a test score, is look at the school's range. They'll publish like a middle 50th percentile range. So if a school's range, their average ACT scores between 25 and a 27, then if it's test optional and you have a 19 or a 20, you probably just don't want to report that. And I think the tricky thing for students, and it's something that counselors are trying to figure out as well, is what's each individual school's policy, and having conversations with your admissions counselor to say, okay, this is what I'm thinking of submitting. Or I think having a conversation like that. There are some colleges that reps I've talked to that have said, hey, it's test optional. If you decide to submit a score and it doesn't help your application, we're not even going to include it in your file. Other schools will say, if you submit it, we're going to judge you on that. We're going to take that into consideration. So it's possible at some schools that they might see that test score and think, well, they submitted it, so it might hurt you. I think that the majority of the college reps I've talked to have said, we're either going to give you some feedback or we're going to say, why don't you look at our middle 50% range? But that is a question. It's a great question, but I think looking at the school's range of ACT and SAT scores, and if yours is not falling into that range, it's probably best to not submit your test score.
Okay. Next question. Should I submit multiple test scores that show improvement over time, or should I only send in my top score?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some schools do what they call super scoring. So they'll say, send in all of your scores, and we will take the highest from the reading section and the science section and the math section, and we put that together, and it's a super score. So if a school says that they super score, then you can send in what you want, and they're going to just automatically take the highest score. However, it's colleges, like college admissions officers, understand that students test more than once, and so this idea that you're improving, I don't know that that's going to stand out as much as it's just going to, if they super score, it's going to populate your highest score for each section. And there's also something to consider with, if you've got some low scores and then some higher scores, if you're paying for each one of those score sends, if you're having to send it from ACT or SAT and it's like $10 or $12 for each score, you want to go ahead and send your highest score. unless they say, oh, we super score, and you've got a couple different tests with high numbers on it. But the idea of like, I'm going to send them all so they can see that I've improved. I don't know that that's going to benefit you, and you'll just probably be out some money sending your scores. That's a good question though.
All right, so there have been 4 that have actually come in through the Q&A. So we'll try to work our way through those and keep an eye on time. We've got about 3 minutes. So
Okay.
First question, would you still recommend students to take tests?
So right now in our area, I will just say that testing is, they're still canceling test sites. So if you're able to, and you're like, no, this is fine, and you're willing to spend the time on a weekend, and you've done some prep and you're happy with it, I think that's fine. What gets kind of iffy is if schools are saying like, no, we really are test optional. If you're driving hours to take a test, or you're having to get up really early and go to a different part of the state, then I don't know that I would, and you just have test optional schools on your list, I'm not sure that I would put myself through that kind of stress. Because think about it, if you're testing, it's might still be stressful if you're having to wear a mask or something. So if it's relatively easy and you have test sites open, I think that would be fine. But if you're going to a lot of trouble to drive different areas to take tests, then I don't know that that's the best use of your time, especially if you have test optional schools on your list.
Okay, that was kind of a answer to 2 questions that were asked. So
Okay.
took care of 2 there. Next one. Hello, this is an international student. I got bad grades, B's and C's in sophomore and freshman year, but I got rank 1 in junior and senior, 1 student out of all students. I did first 2 years of high school outside of America, and I did the last 2 years of high school in America. Should I turn in SAT scores?
So I think if your SAT scores are within a range, within the middle 50 percentile range, that possibly could help you. I think that's probably worth an individual conversation with the admissions counselor of the schools that you're looking at. Because they're also going to be interested to hear like, okay, what was the turnaround after that second year and then you came to America? Like, was it just the change of location, or did you change some of your work habits? Like, what all is going into that? So if your SAT score is high enough to where it's in the middle 50th percentile for college and universities, and yeah, that might help you. But I think that's more of a follow-up in person with the admissions counselor to say, here's my background, here's where I'm coming from.
Mm-hmm. So I recognize we are right at 11. There are 3 more questions. If folks want to stick around, and Caryn, if you're willing to
Sure.
stick around to fill these last 3, we'll cut it off after these 3, but do want to be sensitive to the time. So for those of you that need to take off, we do want to thank you for being with us tonight and participating in this presentation. But we'll go ahead and tackle these last 3, and then we'll call it. So another question, is there an online SAT or ACT option?
No, there's not. Both organizations talked about it, that they were either planning it or it was in the mix. I think the last that I've heard of ACT is they might be rolling something out, but there were some technical issues with AP testing online, and that's the College Board, after they experienced those technical issues, the College Board kind of tapped the brakes and said, oh, we're not ready for this yet. ACT had sort of talked about it, and now they're walking that back too. So as of today, as of right now, there's not a viable online option. Not to say that can't happen in the future, but right now that's not an option.
Okay. You've kind of touched on this a little bit in the previous question from the international student, but this is a little bit more direct. But how do they, meaning schools, account for the international student?
Yeah. So typically when colleges and university admissions officers are reviewing a student's transcript, they have a profile, they have a listing of courses that each high school or university offers, and then they take a look at and evaluate the student based on what they have offered to them, like what kind of options they have offered to them, how they perform in that school environment. So if you're asking, okay, as an international student, how would I how would I stack up against maybe some domestic students? Um, I think they're going to take a look at, in the context of your school, how are you doing, in what sorts of courses are you taking. Um, so again, sometimes the international student question is a better conversation to have with individual admissions officers, because at different colleges and universities, they might have different requirements for international students, whether you have to still take the TOEFL test of English as a foreign language, what types of requirements that they might still have for international students. That's really a good question to follow up with individual admissions officers, because each college and university is probably going to have a different answer.
All right, last question here. It's specific to a major.
Mm-hmm.
If I want to major in child development, should I take the SAT?
So that's a I understand that question. Um, if you're majoring in child development and you are applying to some schools that are test optional, then it's not really necessary this year for you to take the SAT. Um, if you're thinking of it as like, what's this whole process? Like, it can be a good process for you to go through to sit for the test, but the SAT test is not going to give you an advantage as far as, oh, this would be a good candidate because this person took the SAT. If a college or university is truly test optional, where they're not looking at test scores as a requirement, then whether you're going to major in child development or economics or business, that wouldn't necessarily be something that you would need to do if a college is test optional.
All right. There's been one more request to bump back to your info, your contact info,
Sure.
real briefly, so that folks can see that.
I am in Dallas, Texas, and it feels like every weekend a new testing center is closed. So I understand the disappointment and pain of not being able to test when you want to test. And I've been really thankful that the universities that are around us and the NACAP schools have been super flexible and super helpful as far as just connecting with students and easing their fear. So I just encourage all of y'all to make some connections with these NACAP officers. They are there because they love Jesus and they like working with kids and they like working with high school and college students. And so those admissions professionals are going to be a great resource for you to use.
All right, very good. Well, thank you so much for your time, Caryn, and for sharing with us from your experience with your students there at Trinity Christian, and to our participants that are still hanging on with us. Thanks again for joining us. And a recording of this will be posted up on the site probably, I'd say, mid-morning tomorrow. So if you want to cycle back through and catch a few more things that Caryn discussed, you can do that then. If not, then we'll hopefully spend some time the next few weeks at the booths that will still be open. And hopefully we'll see you again at our next virtual event, which will be on November 5th. We'll do this all over again. So thanks, everyone, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.